Livros, banda desenhada, cinema, eventos, críticas e derivados. São os rascunhos de Cristina Alves.
I'm at Mensageiros das Estrelas and I'll be talking with Mike Carey. Mike Carey is the author of several comics, such as Lucifer or The Unwritten, and recently has become known as the author of The Girl with All the Gifts, made into a movie in 2016. Hi, thank you for your time.
Pleasure, thanks for having me on the show.
So, for about 15 years you were a teacher and then you moved on into writing comics. But as far as I know, this transition took some time.
Yeah.
How did you become interested in comics and how did you start writing them?
I think comics had always been in my life. To some extent, I learned to read from comics before I started reading prose fiction. When I was a child in England, there was a tradition of humour comics for younger children, the Beano, the Dandy, the Buster, Topper, Beezer, and they consisted of one-page stories with a humorous tone to them. And I grew up reading those. There were two great creators who were at work in England at that time, Leo Baxendale, who created the Bash Street Kids, and Ken Reid. And Ken Reid in particular was just an astonishing draftsman, an astonishing visual artist. And he created immersive and wonderful worlds that I got completely drawn into. And then when I was about 8, my older brother gave me a Fantastic Four issue, an annual. And it was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Jack Kirby. And it was
the classics.
Yes, so it was the beginning of a lifetime love affair. And I briefly stopped reading comics when I was in my late teens, when I discovered, sex and drugs and rock and roll and stuff. And then I was drawn back in to reading comics by Chris Claremont's X-Men. The X-Men sort of dragged me back in. How did I come to be writing comics? I started writing reviews and articles for fanzines, for free fan magazines. I did a fair amount of that in the 80s. And then through that, I met some people who were working in comics. And one man in particular, Martin Skidmore, who was editing a line of comics for a company called Apocalypse Press. So I pitched some ideas to them. And through that, I met some people who were doing the same thing in America. And I started working for Malibu and then for Caliber. And it took me about 10 years before I sort of knocked on the door at DC and said, give me a job. And then it took another 3 years after that before they did. So it was a very, very long, slow process, but I was always part of that world. I was always a fanatical, devoted fanboy as far as comics were concerned.
What are your major influences, those comics that got stuck into your mind and have an effect in your writing?
Probably the three biggest influences on me were the three British writers of my generation who went to America before me. Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison. The sort of the start of the British invasion of the American mainstream. And those three creators, all of them, I think, immensely talented masters of the medium. They redefined what you could do in long-form comic storytelling, in a monthly, ongoing comic. Gaiman in particular, in Sandman, I think was doing something extraordinary that no one had done before. It was a kind of novelistic approach to comics.
The series was recently published in Portuguese, so only now we have the whole books this year.
It's still astonishing, isn't it? It's still
awesome.
An absolute masterpiece. So those would be my immediate influences. But when I was growing up, I read an awful lot of Silver Age comic books that were quirky and odd, that were doing the superhero thing, but in a very strange and non-standard way. So I loved The Metal Men, which was a DC comic book about a group of robots that fought crime. I loved Dial H for Hero, which is about two little children who have a telephone, and when they dial the letter H, they become superheroes. I loved Doom Patrol, which Grant Morrison gloriously reinvented in the 80s. So those were all influences on me. There was a time when American comic books were not entirely superhero, American mainstream comic books, when DC and Marvel were prepared to do science fiction books and westerns and horror books to a much greater extent than they do now. And I love that stuff as well. I love those other traditions.
Yes, there are several publishers now that do that kind of stuff, like Dark Horse or Image.
Yes.
They usually publish that kind of stuff.
And Boom and IDW.
Yes, also. But from writing to being able to publish is a huge step. How did you publish your first comics?
So my first real comics, my first professionally produced comics. So it came through my friendship with this man, Martin Skidmore.
Mm-hmm.
He was the editor on a fanzine called Fantasy Advertiser, strange title, and I wrote reviews for them, and I wrote some feature articles for them. And then at a certain point, he got some money from a comics distributor, Neptune, to create his own line of comics, and I pitched some ideas to them. They were already going bankrupt at the time. They were running out of money very fast. They were discovering that it was harder to make a profit in comics than they thought. But they published 17 pages of one of my stories. The story was called Aquarius, and it was a sort of very Watchmen-inspired superhero series. In fact, it was in many ways a rip-off of Watchmen. And it was, I wrote about 5 or 6 full scripts, but they only ever published those 17 pages, and the check bounced, so I was never paid for it. But that was my first ever published comic, and that would have been in 1991.
Then came a regular employment at 2000 AD, right? And later this huge series, Lucifer.
Yep.
For Vertigo, around the character that first appears in Sandman by Neil Gaiman. How did you arrive at Vertigo writing Lucifer?
It was a long journey, probably longer than it had to be. I was always very hesitant and reluctant to put myself forward. But I did a lot of work for Caliber, which was an independent publisher back in the 80s and 90s. I did a series for them called Inferno, and I did a graphic novel version of Dr. Faustus for them, and I did some short fiction for them. And everything that I had published at Caliber, I would send to the Vertigo editors, especially to Elisa Whitney, to Karen Berger and to Elisa Whitney, with a begging letter saying, please give me a job, Because Vertigo were publishing all of the comics that I loved at the time. It seemed to be my spiritual home. So I sent them a lot of stuff. Everything that I got published, I would send to them. And then I got a letter back from Elisa Whitney one day, and it was about The Dreaming. She said they were about to start a sequel to The Sandmen called The Dreaming. And she invited me to pitch for that, and I pitched lots and lots of stories, none of which happened. I didn't get any of them accepted. But that started a friendship between us. I kept on talking to her. When they started doing the Sandman Presents line,
yes,
she approached me again and said, would you like to pitch for a Sandman Presents title? We'd really like a Lucifer story. So I said yes. I said I would love to pitch for it. She said, well, you'll need to do it very, very fast, because apparently they had already had a script from another writer, and at the last moment they decided not to use it. So they needed somebody to step into that gap very quickly. She said, we will need a pitch by the end of the week, and if we approve it, you will need to go to script the week after. So I spent 3 days not sleeping, not eating, just putting the pitch together and sent it off. And Elisa liked it, Karen, who was the senior editor at Vertigo, liked it, and crucially, Neil Gaiman liked it too. And they approved me to go to script. And I didn't realize at the time. I mean, I knew I was lucky. I was lucky to be writing for DC. I was lucky to be writing in the Sandman universe, because it was an astonishing playbox, an astonishing continuity to be allowed to play with. But also, I had full painted art by Scott Hampton. So my first outing at DC, I was given this. I was teamed up with this great artist working in his favourite medium, and I still look back on that miniseries and think, wow, what an amazing thing.
And a huge job. It's a huge series and
Yes.
very difficult to master. So,
So fortunately, I was a fan. So yeah, I'd read everything. I'd read every issue of Sandman and obsessed about it. I mean, I've always been somebody who reads the pamphlets, the monthly issues. Not that I read the trades as well.
yes.
But I read things first in that serialized format. And the beauty of that format is that at the end of each issue, you have to wait a month for the next episode.
Yes. It's
you're
awful to wait.
You're hanging on the edge of the story, desperate to see where it's going next. So you spend a month thinking about it and obsessing about it and imagining where it's going to go next. So I'd done that with Sandman. So my head was full of all of these characters and these possible plot lines. So in a way, it was a very easy thing to pick up. In other ways, of course, I was stepping into Neil Gaiman's shoes, which was
Very
daunting.
Yes.
And I think if you look at my Lucifer, you can quite clearly see that for the first few issues, I'm pastiching Neil. I'm writing as though I was Neil, trying my best to imitate his voice and his inflections and his pacing. And then it's around about issue 4, Born with the Dead, that I started to get the confidence to do my own thing and sort of strike off in a slightly different direction.
What were the main challenge in developing a character made by Neil Gaiman?
It was a challenge. I've always tried to be respectful to what came before. So and especially with something like Sandman, where what came before was such a defining work for the medium. So finding an arc for Lucifer that was consistent with the way he'd been portrayed in Sandman, but would still allow me to tell new stories, to take it off in my own direction. It was finding that compromise between what was there already and the new things that I wanted to introduce. And again, when I started to write him, I wrote his voice very much in keeping with his voice in Sandman. But over the course of the 75 issues that I wrote, he changes. He changes as a character, and his voice changes too. The inflections change. But I guess that was the biggest thing. I think also Lucifer as a protagonist creates certain problems, presents certain challenges, because he is so powerful. There are certain things you can't make him do. You can almost never have him fight someone, because he would win that fight in a microsecond.
And Lucifer is a very complicated character in religious terms.
Yes.
He's the devil, he's evil. There's a lot of preconceptions about Lucifer. How did you dealt with it?
Well, I based my Lucifer on William Blake's Lucifer from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And in Blake, Lucifer is not so much he doesn't call him Lucifer, the adversary, Satan, is not so much an incarnation of evil. He's an incarnation of will.
Yes.
Of utterly driving, remorseless, selfish,
Self-centered and selfish. Yes.
Yeah. So the epitome of self-centeredness and selfishness. So he's not somebody who would go out of his way to hurt you, but if you were in his way,
Yes.
he would roll over you and not even notice that you were there, and he wouldn't spend a moment worrying about it. He is literally somebody who would burn a planet to light his cigarette, if that was the only way to get a light. So I was sort of like using Blake very much as a kind of reference point, and using the existing Sandman stories, especially Season of Mists, as the other reference point. And then something wonderful happened when we were 5 issues in, which was that we lost our entire art team, and Peter Gross came on board the title, and that was there are some partnerships, some creative partnerships that actually change everything, and that was one for me.
Yes, you later on developed Unwritten with him, right?
Yep.
So you wrote a lot with him. Why?
I think we bring out the best in each other. from the very first. So he comes onto Lucifer with issue 5. It's the story, The House of Windowless Rooms, and that issue, it's ridiculous when you look at it. I asked him to imagine a completely different afterlife, the sort of Japanese afterlife, and to sort of populate it with creatures, with monsters and demons that had never been seen before, and he didn't flinch for a second. He just went ahead and did it. And I can remember looking at the pencils for those pages and just sort of being filled with a strange ecstasy because they were so wonderful. And he constantly did that. He constantly found better ways of doing the things that were in my head. So the pages that I got back from him were always just better, just more cleverer and more imaginative versions of what I'd already put on the page. An example, there's a character called Christopher Rudd, who is a man who's gone to hell for one terrible deed. He was basically a moral man and a decent man, but he killed a child. And it wasn't an accident, he killed a child deliberately. So he's in hell, and he recognises that that's where he belongs, because he has done this unforgivable thing. And I told that story in 3 pages. It was just a 3-page flashback. And they were 3 perfectly ordinary comics pages with about 5 or 6 panels on each. And Peter said, it shouldn't be like that, because when he remembers that, he can't take his mind off it. He's obsessing about it. He's remembering and remembering and remembering, and he can't get off the treadmill. So he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put like 100 panels on a page. And he did it. He sort of kept on reinscribing those moments, especially the moment after the boy has died, when Rudd looks at his sword and sees the blood on the sword and realises what he's done. And you get that moment, you get the sword coming back in on the 3 pages again and again. And you really get the sense of how trapped he is in that moment. So I learned a lot about storytelling from Peter, and it became increasingly a sort of very organic collaboration. But because he'd come in later than me, because he came in with issue 5, he said he never felt that it was his as much as it was mine. He was a little bit reluctant to make big suggestions and big changes, whereas with Unwritten, we developed it from the first idea. That was completely and utterly shared and collaborative, every aspect of it. So if you look at the credits, it says written by Mike Carey, drawn by Peter Gross, but actually we were both the storytellers
creating the story. There are some authors that like to establish very strict borders for the imagination of the artist. With Peter Gross, it's not the case. But do you work the same with every artist? No,
I don't. I tend to. So if there's a kind of a continuum with Alan Moore at one end, say, and someone like Brian Bendis at the other end, with sort of like very, very fully rendered scripts versus very sketchy, very telegraphic, very open scripts. I'm more towards the Alan Moore end. I tend to write very full, very exacting scripts. I'm one of the writers who sort of always has to be saying exactly where the page turn comes, and I'll sometimes say, this is the biggest panel on the page, build everything around this. So quite a lot of control. With Peter, it's not like that. The script is the beginning of a negotiation between the two of us. Actually, it's not even the beginning. The negotiation starts earlier. Once I've sent in a sort of breakdown for the issue, we'll chat about it and we'll brainstorm it, and then I'll do a script, and then he'll draw the art, and I'll return to it, and we work around the finished art. And it takes a long time, because all good collaboration does. But what comes out at the end is just great. It's just really, really wonderful to work with him. And we, apart from Lucifer and Unwritten, we've also done a 6-part miniseries for IDW, Highest House, which I think is one of my favourite things that I've ever done. I'm incredibly proud of it. And again, Peter is creating an immersive world, a sort of pseudo-medieval, magical fantasy realm, and making it look different and distinctive, and grounded in a lot of physical realities. So the main character works as a roofer, and there's a whole section where he's learning how to thatch, he's learning how to cut shingles, he's learning how to peg tiles and so on. And Peter just renders all those things in a really sort of solid, chewy, believable way. You sort of feel transported into the world.
With this kind of long series like Unwritten or Lucifer, do you plan ahead of the development of the characters? Do you know what will be the start and the end of the characters?
Yes, I think the short answer is yes. I think it's fair to say I always know what the ending is going to be, because the ending is the one thing you've got to get right.
Yes.
There are a million ways of getting to the ending, and so the middle bit of the story, I have a sketchy idea of the important, the sort of the way stations, the things that along the way
need to happen.
Yes. But then you get into the story and you realise actually there's a better thing that could happen, and you veer all over the place. But you always know where you're at, where you're heading towards. So the beginning and the end are crucial. The middle is negotiable.
Yes. How do you plan each issue?
I tend to plan from the top down. So and this is a habit I got into way back when I was working on Lucifer. Because Shelley Bond, who was my second editor on Lucifer, insisted on very, very detailed plans. So I will do a synopsis for a whole storyline, and then I will do a breakdown for each issue. And very often I'll redo the breakdown if the editor thinks it's not fit for purpose. So with Shelley it was great, because you'd send in the breakdown and she'd say, you don't need 3 pages for that scene, you can do that in 2 pages and have a splash over there. She would actually sort of roll up her sleeves and get involved in the planning to that extent. She was very, very detail oriented, and as a result of that I still do that. The other thing I do without fail, even though nobody gets to see it, I actually draw each page. I'm a terrible artist. I have no artistic ability at all. But I draw little stick figures.
Try to project the story into
because it's really important to know what the framing is for each panel. So that's what it is. It's like just deciding, is this going to be a long shot or a close-up? Is it going to be a panorama? And then at the same time, I'll sketch in the dialogue alongside. I'll scribble in the dialogue. So an awful lot of the creative decisions have been taken before I go to script. I have those stupid little sketches in front of me as I'm typing, and it really works for me. I've tried to write without doing the sketches, and it feels wrong. It doesn't flow in the same way.
How hard is to publish an issue with such regularity?
It's not that hard. I mean, it's you get into the rhythm, and it gets easier as you go along, because as with any sort of skill that's mechanical,
it gets easier.
It gets easier, yeah.
Yes.
Every repetition makes it easier, and every repetition makes it easier for you to know your own limitations, your own rhythms, and your own sort of limitations, I guess. With comics, I can spend a day planning, a day doing those page roughs, and a day scripting.
Yes.
And that's an issue, provided I know in advance what the content of the issue is. So 3 days to write it. When I first started writing Lucifer, it was all-consuming. It was a monthly book, and I would spend most of the month writing it. And when they offered me, Will Dennis phoned up and offered me a chance to write Hellblazer as well. I said no, because I couldn't imagine that anyone could write 2 comics in a month. Fortunately, Will said, well, you know what? I'm not going to take that now. I'm going to put the phone down now, and I'm going to wait for you to call me up and tell me you changed your mind, which I did later the same day. And then you realise that you can do 2 books alongside each other. You can even do 3 books alongside each other. You learn how to
organize,
how to organize, and how to make the rhythms work. And then at a certain point, I was writing novels as well. I was doing screenplays as well, and it gets exponentially harder. But because comics are unique, because there is, after you send in your draft, there are a whole bunch of people who are waiting immediately to work on it. And if you're late on a deadline, then the artist
everyone falls down. Yes.
Yeah, the artist is in trouble because you've messed up. So you're kind of taking food out of other people's mouths.
It's like Domino's line.
Yeah, exactly like that. And so when I'm doing a novel and working on comics as well, the comic deadline has to come first.
Yes, of course.
Because there are those other things depending on it.
And you also worked with Neverwhere, another work by Neil Gaiman. You gave it a very specific tone and peculiar aspect, quite different from what I imagined. What were the main difficulties about adapting this novel into comic? It's one of my favorites.
I loved working on that. I loved working with Glenn Fabry. Again, I've been incredibly lucky with my artists. The main difficulties, I think a novel adapts badly into other formats unless you have an infinitely large canvas, because novels are huge. And by and large, comic miniseries are not huge, and movies are not huge.
Yes.
So the first thing you do with the adaptation is you take the story apart and you look at all the pieces. You look at what they're doing. What are the key beats here? How many issues do I need to get those beats across? And so John Bankin was the editor on that, and he started by saying it's a mini-series, but you decide how many issues. How many do you need? And initially I said something like 6. And then I started looking at it and thought, I can't do it in 6. I need at least 8. And in the end we went for 9.
It's a much more complex work than it looks at the first glance.
Yeah, it really is. And we had to make some decisions about storytelling, because with any kind of adaptation, it's a reinvention. Different media work in different ways, and they're different toolkits for telling stories. So we made the decision that we would have a first-person narration from Richard. Whereas the novel uses omniscient narrator. And in some ways, as soon as you have a first-person narrator, then you know that character is going to survive, so maybe you're removing some of the tension, but what you get is an emotional immediacy. So that was one thing we did, and we changed the structure as well, to remove a kind of loop in the original novel, which works in the novel, but I think would have been harder to pull off in the comic. It's to do with the 2 times when they meet with the angel. So we make the first meeting be on a sort of astral plane rather than in reality. So yeah, it was that in the unwritten, I have Lizzie. I have one of the characters, Lizzie, say that she studies stories in the same way that a soldier learns how to strip a rifle. And I think adaptation, one of the joys of adaptation is it's like stripping a rifle and then putting it together again. And you just, if it's a good story, and Neverwhere is a very good story, you're left with this sense of admiration for the meticulously tooled parts and how they fit together. And you learn a lot about your own storytelling from looking at other people's.
Yeah, you have picked a lot of other people's work, other characters, other universe. Do you prefer to work with other people's work, or invent your own universe, your own characters?
They're different pleasures, and I can't I can't really say that one's better than the other. They're just different.
Yes.
One of the thrills of working in an established universe, if it's one that you love, is that you're getting to add chapters to a story that you're already invested in. Weirdly, one of the best examples of this is the superhero work I did at Marvel. I worked on X-Men for quite a long time, for about 5 years, and I'd grown up with the X-Men. One of the first comics that I sort of followed was the original Stan Lee run, and there was a kind of a weirdly intense fulfillment, really, to go back there as a creator. And to feel that it's almost like you're adding rooms to a house that you lived in as a child. My first arc of the X-Men, I invented a new group of villains called the Children of the Vault, and about 2 weeks later, someone sent me a link to a Wikipedia article about the Children of the Vault, which just described all the characters. And I thought, I'm in canon, I'm canonical. The thing that I've written is now part of that universe, and it's accepted as being part of that universe. And that was very, very pleasant and exciting. But there's no denying that if you're creating a universe that's entirely your own, there are freedoms that you have there that you don't have if you're working on a franchise book. A good example there would be that I did a book called Suicide Risk for Boom Studios, and it was a superhero book, but it was outside of any continuity, so I was able to invent characters to fit specific plot needs without any constraints imposed by their pre-existing their pasts and their continuity.
changing the subject into books, mainly fantasy. You wrote the Felix Castle series and more recently The Girl with All the Gifts. In this book, you created a future where the mankind is being wiped out by a fungal infection. First of all, what are the main differences between writing comics and books?
I think the biggest difference for me is that with comics, the canvas has a fixed size.
Yes.
With a novel, it's as big or as small as you need it to be. I started out, actually, before I ever did any work in comics, I tried to write some novels in my late teens and early 20s. And I actually got as far as finishing some of them, but they were awful. They were big, shapeless bags of story. They had no structure to them at all because I didn't understand about structure. And then I stopped trying to do that. I got discouraged and I started doing the comics journalism work, and then I started trying to write comic scripts. And immediately that you're writing a comic script, you're aware that the canvas it's 22 pages, or it's 20 pages, or it's 17 pages, and you have to get in, tell your story, and get out in that space. So there's no way of doing it that doesn't depend on thinking, page 1, this is going to happen, page 2, this is going to happen. You have to plan.
To structure, yes.
You have to plan, you have to structure, and you have to know what your transition points are. All of those decisions become conscious decisions. Once I've been doing that for a few years, going back to novels,
what's easier?
You almost get drunk on the freedom because you have such a massive degree of control over the narrative, and because you live with the narrative for 6 months or 9 months a year, you can get to chapter 20 and suddenly think, I want to bring in a character here. Go back to chapter 3 and
yes.
put that character in. Whereas with a comic, as soon as you finish
it was released, so you can't go back.
It goes to the artist and then it's out of your hand.
Why fantasy?
Because it's what I love. I think you can't produce unless you consume passionately. So anything that you're writing in has to be something that you love reading or love watching, or depending on the medium, listening to. I've always loved genre fiction. I did an English literature degree, so I have in the past read conventional fiction. And I love poetry, especially sort of romantic and modern poetry. I watch Shakespeare plays. I go to the ballet sometimes, but most of my leisure time is spent on genre fictions, and fantasy, sci-fi, and horror are my home. They just feel like my spiritual home.
Do you feel that these genres have a role in modern society? Sometimes
yes.
they seem to be pushed away from adulthood. It's like it's not serious. It's not what big people do. It's for children.
So I would like to I'd like to line up behind Ursula Le Guin here. She said in one of her essays, people who don't read science fiction and fantasy think that it's escapist.
Yes.
They think that it's all about excursions outwards into other worlds, and it's really not. It's about incursions into this world.
Alienating the world and giving a different sense and different aspects of the problems we have today, but transposing them into a different world. It's my feeling about it.
And by transposing them, making them more visible and more understandable.
Exactly.
I think, yes. So I do think they have a role. I think they have a vital role.
The Girl with All the Gifts has become a movie, and you were the one that adapted to script. How was the process? When you wrote the book, did it cross your mind that it would turn into a movie?
So the truth is stranger here, because I did write the screenplay, but it wasn't an adaptation of the novel, because the novel didn't exist.
Okay, it was the other way around, okay.
I wrote a short story.
Okay.
The short story is called Iphigenia in Aulis, and it's the first 100 pages of the novel. It's about Melanie at the base, before the base falls, and it ends with Melanie and Sergeant Parks fighting together, back to back. And it's as much about Melanie and Parks as it is about Melanie and Justino. And I wrote it and sent it in, and then I couldn't stop thinking about the character, and I couldn't stop thinking about the world. I felt there's more here. There's another story to be told. So I pitched it to my publisher and said, I want to write this novel. And at the same time, I showed the short story to a producer, Camille Gatin, a French producer who lived in London and worked in London. And I got the green light on both things at the same time. So I started work on the novel and on the sort of first outline for the movie simultaneously. Wrote the novel very quickly, really quickly, in like 6 or 7 months. It just flowed out of me very smoothly indeed. And sent that in, carried on working on the movie for 1.5 years after that, because movies just take longer, they have a longer gestation period. But while I was working on both together, it was a wonderfully organic sort of process. It felt like I was living in that world and trying to find two different paths through the same story space, because the stories are roughly parallel, but they're not identical.
Yes.
There are some decisions that we make in the movie that are different from what I made in the novel. But each one sort of illuminated the other and made it easier. There was no confusion or there was nothing problematic about it. It was a joy to work on that. I think partly because I was working with amazing people. So Camille, who was the lead producer, and Colin McCarthy, who was the director. They were incredibly inspiring and gifted collaborators, and also they gave me all the space I needed to develop the story, and they went with me on that journey. The three of us did so much of the planning together for the movie. We all felt that we owned it, and then when they came to do the location, the tech reconnaissance to find the locations for the film, I came along on that. I was involved in some of the casting and so on, and then I was on set, and then I was in the movie.
How was it?
It was wonderful. It was wonderful. I'm one of the zombies
Very
who
different
dies.
experience from producing comics,
Yeah,
right?
yes, it was. So I'm one of the zombies who dies at the fence. I get my head blown off. But it was it was so wonderful to be part of that, and to meet the cast, and they invented reasons for me to be on set. I think generally speaking, the writer is the last person you need on set.
To see, yeah.
But Colin sort of found things for me to do, like the scene where Gallagher is in the newsagents. He got me to design the front pages of the newspapers and so on.
So you also wrote some books in your family: The Steel Seraglio, The City of Silk and Steel, and The House of War and Witness. How did you involve your whole family into writing?
That was just serendipity, really. It was a case of being in the right place at the right time. My wife Lynn and our daughter Louise, are both writers in their own right. I'd already collaborated with Lou on a comic book, Blabbermouth, and we talked for a long time about doing a novel together. But that's all we'd done. We talked endlessly. We used to have working lunches where we would plan chapters for the novel. We'd go out for a Chinese meal and we'd talk about the novel, and then I would take notes, and then we'd do the same thing a month later, and then we'd do the same thing a month after that, and it wasn't going anywhere.
Okay.
But then we went to EasterCon, which is one of the big sci-fi conventions in England, and we met a Canadian, a couple of editors from Canada, Brett Savory and Sandra Casturi, and they were looking for pitches, and they said, pitch something to us, and we said, we've got this great idea, and they said, okay,
do it.
You're commissioned, do it. We need a draft by January.
Know what?
So suddenly we had to get serious about it, and it was logistically very challenging because there were three of us, and we had to sort of create a coherent narrative that had three different voices in it. So the first thing we did was we went away and we wrote sample chapters in the voice of the narrator, came back, read them aloud to each other, and argued back and forth until we found a voice that we were all comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And then we wrote a plan based on all the previous plans, and we chose chapters. We said, I'll do the first draft of this, you do the first draft of that, and each of us would go away and write a chapter or a couple of chapters, send it to the other two, and the other two would sort of edit it and punch it up. And try to make it coherent. And then crucially, at the last moment, when everything was written, Louise, our daughter, went through and did a harmonising pass, where she just basically said, I'm going to be the editor for all of you. and that was a very, very necessary step, I think. But I came out of that in a different place. I'd never done that before. I mean, I'd done co-writing on comics, but not like that. Not in such an intense and full-on sort of way. And working with two strong-willed women who had their own voices, and doing that for 3 years, I think I came out of it with my own voice profoundly changed. Girl with All the Gifts was the first novel that I wrote after that, and it's different. It's a departure from anything I'd done before.
Do you plan to repeat the experience?
I'd love to, and I think all three of us would love to, but it's hard. It's hard to find times when we're all free. In Lou in particular now has her own. She's working on her own novel sequence, and also she has about 3 or 4 other jobs, all of them one way or another to do with writing. And so I think it's not going to be anytime soon. But I think, yeah, if the opportunity arose, we would do it.
You just published another book, Someone Like Me. I haven't read it yet. Could you talk a little bit about this book?
I would be delighted. It's a standalone novel. It's a thriller. It's the less you know about it going in, the better in a way. It's about a woman who is a mother of 2. She's been trapped in an abusive marriage for 20 years. She's finally got free. She has a divorce, but the abusive partner is still in her life because he still has visitation rights over the children, and he is still violent. And it starts with Mark, the ex-husband, assaulting Liz, my protagonist, and he seems so angry that he may kill her. He's strangling her. He has his hands around her throat, and suddenly, out of nowhere, she's filled with strength and willpower that she didn't know were in her. She's able to fight him off. She's able to basically hold him at bay until the police arrive. But whatever thing came into her at that moment, it won't leave. There is now this other thing inside her, which at certain times takes over, and it's very violent. It's full of rage and full of
Rated.
Yes, and she realizes she has to find out what it is, and she has to either come to terms with it or find a way to get rid of it. The trouble is, in some ways, she still needs it because the ex
to fight off the ex.
He's still around, and he wants revenge, and so she's kind of caught in a quandary. What should she do about this? And there are different ways in which the story could resolve. If this is a supernatural story, then it's a demon.
Yes.
If it's a psychological thriller, then it's some other buried part of her own personality. And it's a while before you figure out what's actually going on.
What are the next books and comics releases?
So comics, Highest House, which was my latest work with Peter Gross, has just come out in a collection from IDW. And it's a beautiful book. Yuko Shimizu did the covers. Peter did some of the best art of his life. So that's in the world now. My Barbarella issues are now being collected as well. So both of those things are sort of are happening, but I've finished the writing on them. I'm in the middle of a trilogy of novels. I wrote the first one last year, and I'm halfway through the second one now. I'm really happy with them too. I'm very excited about them. In some ways it's going back into Girl with All the Gifts territory because it's post-apocalyptic, but it's a long, long way after the apocalypse, so it's many, many centuries after our society. Yeah, post-apocalyptic. It's after our society has ceased to exist, but the people who've come after us don't even remember us. They barely remember us. They're not literate, so they have no written records to draw on. And it's a young boy in the Yorkshire, in the Calder Valley in Yorkshire, coming of age, trying to find his place in society, and he decides he's going to journey to the long-lost city of London. Because the rumours say that there are great treasures to be found there. And in some ways he does find great treasure, but it's not the treasure he's looking for.
And movies, do you have something planned? Would you like to?
So I'm still doing screenwriting as well, yeah. I'm working on a TV series based on the Felix Castor novels. I'm working on a movie version of Fellside, the novel that I wrote after Girl with All the Gifts. I'm working on a TV mini-series based on Someone Like Me, and a TV series based on The Unwritten. So there's lots of things going on, and they're all adaptations
Of your own
my
work,
stuff.
yes.
So it's all things that I'm quite passionate about, but they're moving at different paces. One of the things I've learned about screenwriting is that it's impossible to plan the workload because things drift in and out of focus. They'll stall for 6 months and then come live again.
Yes.
And suddenly you get a set of edit notes and you have to write another draft. But yeah, all of those things are percolating, and one or more of them may happen.
You still have time to read and to review?
I still read. I don't review.
Okay.
Occasionally I'll blurb. Occasionally I'll just write a little sentence about something. But I'm actually reading a lot right now. I have a deal with Lynn, my wife, that if one of us is cooking, the other will read aloud to them. So she's reading me Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, and I'm reading her Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And then I'm also reading a novel by John Langan called The Fisherman, which I brought with me. And I'm reading The Book of Dust by Philip Pullman.
Yes,
which
I know.
is the,
I've read it yet.
I've only just started. It's lovely, wonderful,
Yes.
wonderful
Did you
stuff.
read the first trilogy?
Yes, a long
Awesome.
time. When it first came out, it's an absolute masterpiece. Yeah, so I'm in the middle of a lot of things. I don't think you can write unless you read.
Yes.
I think you have to be a passionate reader in order to be a creator.
Yes, in order to know stories, to know what other authors have done, in order to develop your own voice and to construct original work.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Livros, banda desenhada, cinema, eventos, críticas e derivados. São os rascunhos de Cristina Alves.